I'm Katherine Ashmore, and welcome to the Mindset Exchange. In this episode, we explore the world of journalism with Patricia de Mesquita, a seasoned journalist and filmmaker whose career spans over 2 decades. Patricia has worked in some of the most remote and challenging corners of the world, covering critical topics such as radicalisation, child slavery, climate change, and life in conflict zones. With a portfolio that includes award-winning foreign affairs series and 15 years as a producer for BBC News and Current Affairs, Patricia brings a wealth of experience to this conversation. We discuss the challenges and opportunities of being a woman in journalism, managing fear in high-pressure and dangerous situations, and how perfectionism and the inner critic can impact storytelling. She also shares her thoughts on the skills journalists need today for aspiring journalists and the impact of social media in journalism. This is a conversation filled with experienced insights for anyone fascinated or curious about the power and responsibility of storytelling in a modern world. Here goes. Hi, Patricia, and welcome. Before we explore your work and experiences, I'd love to hear why you went into journalism and filmmaking. What is your why?
Well, first of all, Catherine, thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here. So the why of my path is probably different to the why of many others. I was not in any way, shape or form interested in journalism as a child. I wanted to write stories. I was interested in people. And I think that will fuel then later why I became a journalist. I wanted to write. I wanted to work in filmmaking and cinema. And I was just incredibly curious about other people's lives. And I became a journalist almost by complete accident. I was working on a project in Yemen for quite a few months before 9/11 happened. And I traveled all my life. I was born in Kenya. My father was Brazilian, my mother Austrian. I grew up between East Africa and Europe and traveled extensively in South America and the Middle East. And the time that I spent in Yemen was in a remote part of Yemen, in Marib, away from the capital Sana'a. I was researching a documentary for an independent company called Atlantic Productions that was looking at the Queen of Sheba and Sabaean archaeological remains. And I spent 3 or 4 months there without the crew arriving, researching on the ground, and spent a lot of times with tribal leaders. And we had lots of discussions about many things, including the West and the West's arrogance towards the Middle East. And I spoke to people who had just came back from Afghanistan, who had worked or had waged what they said was their jihad in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 90s. I was in Yemen for a long time and had these extraordinary conversations with tribal leaders and their wives. And 9/11 happened. And 9/11 was an absolute catalyst for me. I was really drawn to becoming almost like a translator between these two worlds that I understood and almost be a vessel, a communicator between them. And it sounds terribly naive and arrogant, but I came back from Yemen, continued working in that production company, and started writing huge amounts of letters to Channel 4, to the BBC, and in particular to a program at the BBC called Correspondent at the time, which tells you how old I am, because I no longer exist and it became This World. And I looked at all the different editors of all the programs and one person in particular, and I just bombarded the woman with my CV and said, listen, I speak a few languages. I have studied international conflict resolution at university and in particular terrorism. I am just fresh back from Yemen and the Middle East. And can I be useful? Can I come on board any project that you're making in that region or looking at the so-called war on terror that George W. Bush wants to wage? And after many coffees with her and attempts, she said, yes, we have a project and it's looking at all the foiled plots prior to 9/11 and come aboard. So I started from a position of a researcher, and my journalism journey was an arc. It was really an education. And for the 15 years that I ended up spending at the BBC, it was really a learning process. So my why was fueled by a sense of intense curiosity, intense desire to communicate or to be a translator between two worlds that maybe had nothing in common with each other, bringing stories that were untold, underserved to a wide audience that would probably never have heard of those stories, to hold powerful people to account, which I felt needed a lot of work in. So from that position of naivety, I grew up and became a journalist. I think I had no idea what it entailed and the hard work that it entailed and the integrity and the checks and balances and the incredible duty of care and the mindset it took to be a journalist. So knowing the limitations of what journalism is also as important to me. We were there to talk to power without fear, without favor, to hold people to account, to ask hard questions, to be willing to go the distance, to be courageous, to sit with people at sometimes the worst moments of their lives, be porous and a great listener to their story, but you are not an activist. I think that was my learning curve. So I might have started thinking, oh, I can bring incredible stories out there and I can interview those people and I'm great at access negotiation and I can get into prisons and I can get access to these tribal leaders and these jihadis, which I did. But being a journalist is much more complicated than that and harder than that. And so my why changed over the years. It changed into a desire to continue living in a democratic society where we're able to hold to something like the truth. I'm a huge believer in fact, and that those facts are capable of holding the fabric of a healthy society together. So that has now become my why. But at the beginning, it was fueled by exhilarated sense of adventure, desire to go out there and sit with people that might feel terrifying to some and human to others and traumatized. And I just wanted to get that story across. And then later it morphed into something quite different. Another sense of purpose, I suppose.
Yeah. And having that sense of purpose really fuels us. And touching back, and thank you for sharing all that. It's truly incredible what you've done and also the places you've been to and the situations you've been in. I just want to explore that a bit, just in case people aren't really aware of what it was like back then. As a woman journalist, you were going into these situations which were potentially dangerous, and you were also witnessing traumatic situations. And your whole superpower as a journalist is to be emotionally engaged. And as you were saying, to say the truth or to report the facts, even when you're witnessing traumatic events. With some of these places, what sort of training did you get and what sort of skill set did you have to pull on in order to be able to do that?
First of all, being a woman, I think a major asset, a huge asset on many, many levels. I was working primarily in the Middle East and in Africa and in very traditional, very patriarchal societies, and then in Asia later. And for me, being a woman has only been an asset, hugely beneficial, to be underestimated. People think you're this eccentric person who's going out there. But it's been an incredible asset because you get, especially in those very patriarchal societies, these very traditional societies, and in situations where you're covering radicalisation and jihad and Qaeda, you are seen as this third sex or something terribly eccentric or slightly naive. You're never mistaken for, or at least not in the beginning, you were not mistaken for a mercenary or a soldier or a spy. You were seen as something quite eccentric, slightly naive and slightly idiotic. And the willingness of these people to sit down with you and tell you their story was incredible. Just the fact of being open to their stories as a woman was incredible. And I managed to go to places that my male colleagues could not get to. And that's something that you forget. Those places, you get access to the kitchens. You get access to the bedrooms. You get access to the children. And as a woman, you relate to these women in a way that men, you get a 360-degree approach to storytelling that a lot of my male counterparts didn't get. And I was a producer. I went out there before the reporter, who was often male, came out too. So I managed to get trust in ways that my male counterparts didn't really always get. And equally, I could speak to operatives and counterintelligence operatives in ways that my male counterparts couldn't, because they didn't see me as terribly threatening. There was a value, I think, in being underestimated and seen as something of an oddity. And I found that incredibly helpful. And then from an emotional point of view, one of the most important skill sets as a journalist is to be able to listen, sitting down with people, being emotionally porous to their stories. So you're sitting with people who've been through extraordinary trauma, or people who are trying to tell you their side of the story that you know is not something, generals who've maybe committed a massacre. It's not your job to shut them off. And it doesn't mean that you condone anything that they do, but you have to be willing to hear them out. It's your job to not give equal weight to the story. I don't think there's such a thing as you have to be truthful, not neutral. A massacre is a massacre. A child's dying in terrible agony. You have to call that out, but you have to be able to listen. And when you sit down with people who've been incredibly traumatized, you have to be able to compartmentalize. It's a very strange and very, I think, difficult thing to do, but you have to be paradoxically quite porous emotionally, but also know that this is not your story. This is their story. And you have to bring that back to as wide an audience as possible and bring context and bring nuance and compartmentalize it enough so that you don't go to pieces. So you get not a lot of training on that. You get much more hostile environment training, which is how to apply a tourniquet and how to give first aid training and how to prepare, intellectually prepare, know your militias, know your separatist groups, know how to speak to various commanders in a very complicated landscape. You prepare beforehand, and then you get on the field and you will have incredible people in the field that take you by the hand. You have a fixer and a translator and a driver who know far more than you do because they live there, but other things that they might not know. So it's that preparedness intellectually coupled with your emotional people skill, I suppose, that will then come into giving as best a story as possible. I was super lucky because I was not a freelance. I'm not a war correspondent. I wasn't a freelance person going into conflict zones without any protection. I had a huge organization behind me. They knew what we were doing at all times. They were incredibly great at preparing for hostage situations, for what happens. You go through risk assessments, very complicated risk assessments before you're deployed. And once you're deployed on the ground, you continue having those conversations with people back. And then in the edit, you continue having those conversations. At every step of the way, you have an editorial policy and a team that collaborates in telling the story with you. And they ask questions that are super pertinent, and you might get totally wrapped up in a story. And it's for you and to them to be open-minded to the nuances and to understand what the audience needs, because they wouldn't be able to relate to something super complicated in the same way that you have maybe been possibly traumatized. The story that you tell is the most important thing. And there are rail guards in place before, during, and after that allow you to tell that story as well as possible, that I found incredibly useful. And it's the mindset itself. You are curious and a voracious reader, and you are passionate about a subject, outraged by something, furious about an injustice. But then on the ground, you listen. And you are compassionate and empathetic, and you try as much as possible to listen to two sides of a story. You're not caught in an echo chamber. You are willing to sit with things that are quite unpleasant, that are fundamentally different to your sets of values. And you don't judge, but you just tell the facts and you report those facts as best as you can.
You talked earlier about how in these situations you learn to compartmentalize. Now, it was quite dangerous. There were women journalists being put into awful situations, which I won't go into, but one can use one's imagination. And these were your colleagues that you'd worked with. So without delving into that too deeply, thinking about an important aspect of journalism when there's a producer or someone on the ground, when you're going to these situations, is it's natural to feel fear. How does one manage fear in a way that you can help it, use it to help you to be not only vigilant and sharp, but also in general?
I think fear has huge evolutionary significance. It's there for a reason, and it's your friend. It should be your friend, but it has to be your servant. It can never be in the driving seat. And so when we came back to that story of preparedness, you prepare, you know that you could be at risk, and you know that your fear is there to protect you, but it should be at the back of your mind. You have to have a degree of awareness of everything. You know that you've prepared extremely well, and you know how to read a room, and it must not turn into panic. I think that's the most important thing. It's that fine line between fear that is helpful and is something that will allow you to survive a situation and be a great human, to sit down with people who've been in these horrific situations. But it must not then veer into complete, crazy, blind panic. The idea of fear serving you is very important, but not the other way around.
Yeah.
Fear cannot take over. And it's something that you're trained to do. You have it built within it. I think complacency is a huge problem on the ground. And when you meet these kind of swashbuckling journalists in places who just are there for the glory, and that's never been my case. I love adventure and I love traveling, but I'm terribly afraid of things. I've never wanted to go into that job because I felt I didn't have fear. It's on the contrary, because I have a lot of fear that I do what I do. I'm just interested in making fear more understandable to me. I went into a line of work. I covered separatist movements and so-called terrorists, and I wanted to make sense of that. So fear has always been part of my life. I've always had anxiety. I've lived with anxiety for a long time. I'm quite open about that, and everyone knows that about me. But harnessing your fears through understanding and knowledge and fact gathering, and very often you are able to make your fear more understandable if you bring it back to an audience, that there are also diplomatic channels out there, dialogues to have had, other sets of values and other conversations that will actually help you bring a situation to a more peaceful end. Fear is a huge area of interest to me. How you mitigate it through conversations and listening to others and going to places that you are afraid of. Because once you're on the ground, you feel that maybe the fear that you had before is not exactly the fear that you should have had, but not letting it overcome you. That's super important. And yes, the longer you are in that job, the longer you will have friends who have been abducted or in terribly dangerous situations. Some of them would have gotten killed. I've had friends who had killed and friends who underwent sexual violence against them. And that's a real problem on the ground, always. But fear is there for a reason, and you have to use your mind to contain that fear in order to do the best job you can.
Thank you for sharing that, Patricia. I really appreciate that. We move on from that. Perfectionism can be quite high in journalism.
You set out to tell a story that you feel will illuminate something that has maybe sparked outrage in you. You want to tell a story because you feel it's important to tell that story because it's been underreported or underserved or there's a terrible thing happening out there, not enough people are covering it, or not in the way that you think. Or you think you could have another angle to that story that could illuminate something different. And so perfectionism is there at the start. You want to get access to as many voices as possible to tell that very complicated story is in as nuanced and perfect way, but there's no such thing as that. And it's so hard. I remember beating myself up because I could not get access to that prison or that hostage or that perpetrator or the family of someone who had bombed Parisian underground or committed a massacre somewhere. I wanted to get hold of their family and their kids, and I couldn't because they wouldn't just grant it to me. Or in some cases I did get that, but I didn't get the other side. I didn't get the victims. Or in the edits, a lot of stuff is dropped out because the editor decides that this is not relevant and you have fought so hard to get that. And so you have to make peace with their judgment on that, and you can fight for it to a certain degree. But at every step of the way, again, in your preparation and then in your access on the ground and then in the edit suite, and then when the film comes out and is not seen, or you have your kind of investigative piece coming out at the same time as the final of the X Factor, and it's just not going to be seen or watched. Nowadays, things are terribly different because you have iPlayer, but certain pieces that I made back in the day were just disappeared, or they were too obscure and you thought they were really important. It's so important to keep a sense of humility in the face of what you can cover and what you can't cover. It's also incredibly important to understand, actually, a fantastic series director told me once, the great is always the enemy of the good. And I actually hadn't thought about it, but yes, absolutely. You can't be perfect. There's no such thing as the perfect story, and you will always be criticized. Your role is to tell the story as truthfully as possible so that it's as relatable as possible to the audience. And with that truth, you will always find people. I think to be criticized by both sides is quite a good thing. With someone like in the war at the moment in Gaza, it's impossible to tell a story that's a child that died on the 7th of October and a child that died under the bombing in Gaza deserves their story to be heard in equal measures, but there's no such thing as neutrality. There shouldn't be. You can try to tell a story. You must try to know your failings as a journalist. You're not there to push the needle. You're there to just tell a story that possibly could have an impact later, and where someone could pick up a phone to their MP or themselves. But your role is not to be an activist. Your role is not to change the world. Your role is to shine a light as truthfully and as factually as possible, and with hard work, and to do the best you can to get those stories out as best you can. But then it's to the audience.
Yeah, there can be pressure of comparison and competition in the industry. And there are elements, of course, which you've touched on where activism can be quite useful in the sorts of situations that you're going to in terms of preparedness. Do you mind sharing how perfectionism has challenged you in any way?
There's so many points where I just didn't feel I was good enough because you're competing, you're bringing stories, lots of people out there to tell the same stories from different angles. And you're pitching a story that you feel is extremely important. Another news channel or another broadcaster beats you to it. That is hard because you feel you had something to bring to the table that was different, but then you're in a hugely competitive environment. And the ecosystem is such today that you have 24/7 news cycles where you're constantly trying to feed stories and to tell different stories and to access the same stories at the same time from different angles. I was not in that world so much as in the long form documentary world. And there as well, you spend a long time investigating a story and taking your time to tell that story as best as you can. And someone cuts corners and pays for access and gets an angle and gets it out there quicker than you have had time diligently to get that story out there yourself. And that's super difficult. And I have found in my line of work, you build trust over time. The most important thing for me was my contributors on the ground. And you have such a duty of care to them and to their story and to the people that are your fixers and your crew on the ground, with whom you have worked maybe for years and years. And perfectionism plays into that fear that you are letting them down if your story doesn't come out or if you put them in any form in danger. And that was something that has always been there on my shoulder. Have I done enough? Has that been good enough? Could I have done more to stay a bit longer to get access to this? I've had to get out because there was no budget, or because it became too dangerous, or because we were exposed or exposing them. And that has always been super hard. So the idea of perfectionism, you're running, you're pressurized, you're running against competing broadcasters, your audience demands something else. There's something like attention deficit disorder on a massive scale out there at the moment. So you want a story that resonates now, you want it now. And I am a huge fan of taking time for things. And I found over time, you were making, and it's the same, I think, in a lot of places today, you're making very fast turnaround film. You have a pressure, you have to get it out at a certain time, and you don't have much time to go deep. And I think that's a huge problem. And there's a balance contradictory to that, in that you don't want to overcomplicate a story to such an extent that the context is so obtuse that the audience doesn't get it. You want them to get it and relate to it. So you have to simplify it to a certain degree, but not make it untrue. There are lots of pressures to that idea of perfection. You want to tell a very complicated story in a relatable way. So you have to balance that. But equally, there are pressures out there of getting the story out quickly. And then you can make the mistake of making it so simple that it's an either or, when it's actually an and.
You mentioned it's been a pressure on your shoulder the whole time, but you must have learned certain tactics to deal with it along the way. Would you mind sharing those with the audience?
I think talking to people, again, the power of sitting down, sharing and listening, collaborative efforts, working as part of a team with them. Someone is able to say to you, actually, I had no idea about this story, and what you've done is good enough, because it has taught me one angle that I had no idea about. And that's incredibly illuminating and powerful and important. And that has really helped me. I'm my worst enemy, because I'm super convinced that I have not gone the distance. And having people out there to say, actually, you know what? This is a really incredibly interesting story. And this is an incredibly powerful character that you've had access to. And her story would not have been told. And listen to people on the ground tell you, thank you so much for sitting with me, because no one else has. No one else has asked me how I was in that equation. It's been super helpful. It's been helpful after transmission to hear from people in the countries where you reported from that it made a tiny difference, that someone reached out to them. I've made a story in southern Ethiopia many years ago now, and I've had an incredible response saying, oh, we gave to Médecins Sans Frontières and we've tried to help, and this was something we had no idea was happening. And that was super nice to hear. So that feedback was incredible, to hear that you made a tiny difference when you thought it was possibly just going to fall into a black hole. So listening to your team, listening to people outside and being able to speak about it has been super helpful. Just sharing and not feeling ashamed all the time. That has been super important, because it's a very judging environment, the news environment, or working in factual documentaries. You're always judging someone else's work, and you always see people getting incredible accolades and going to these incredible film festivals and getting awards for it. And then you feel you've spent so much time trying to get access to something so important that maybe fell into a black hole or wasn't seen by many people or heard, but someone somewhere, it helped something somewhere, possibly. And you worked really hard to get a story, and that hard work and that attempt sometimes has been valuable somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that's really nice. Oh, it's something that is really helpful.
That sense of the inner critic is often quite naughty, isn't it? Or it'll pipe up now and then and go, you could have done this, or I'm not good enough. But actually, your best is good enough. And what's important in these situations is you've got your cheerleaders around you, or your work has made a difference, and you know it's made a difference because you've had feedback. And these are some things that the audience can take away and utilize and practice, whatever path of work you're in or whatever life you're leading. Going back to the journalistic landscape again, you must have seen it change so much in the last 20 years. And when we're talking about the journalistic landscape, you co-founded a program teaching young kids how to spot fake news and become media savvy. Would you mind talking through why you decided to do that?
Yeah, well, it feeds into many, many things. I mean, technology changed to an absolutely huge degree. I left working as an investigative journalist 9 years ago. And 9 years ago, I left the BBC and I became a freelancer. And it was the time when you remember the elections when Trump won and when Brexit happened. And I felt it was so important to bring into classrooms, especially my kids were in a primary state school, where there was no such thing as a debating society. There was no such thing as media literacy classes or digital literacy classes. And I felt it was so important to get kids to understand what it means to be a citizen. As simple as that, in a democratic society. The fact that they might not yet be able to vote, but they're 8 years old, they're not quite in the age where they're just scrolling endlessly through social media, but they're in an age where they're still massively curious, massively porous, massively aware of the world around them, and how to give them those soft skills and those tools to become an engaged citizen that is able to enter any room and ask questions. I think it's fundamental to me that whoever you are, you can enter a room and speak to a powerful person without fear and ask them simple questions, hold them to account for what they're doing. And so I set up with a couple of colleagues, we co-founded this thing called News Nuggets, which was essentially a media literacy club for school kids and teaching them how to become a little journalist. So taking the precepts of editorial standards and regulations from the BBC, for instance, or from news organizations and bringing them into classrooms. So how do you write an article? What are your source materials? How do you deal with information or too much information? Is information the same thing as knowledge? Is an opinion the same thing as a fact? Very, very basic things that we might instinctively know or not know, but that could get and that can get completely lost today because there's so much information out there all the time. And because kids are not getting their news from mainstream media, they're getting it from YouTube channels or from social media or from Twitter or X today. And how do you get them away from their echo chambers and teach them the capacity to be compassionate, empathetic, listen? I think these are skills that are essential as a citizen in a democratic society. I think for me, it was more or less a love letter to journalism that I set up in those classrooms, because I felt that more than ever, it is essential that we uphold that profession, especially because it's so vilified, because mainstream media is bashed left, right, and center. And on the one hand, social media, brilliant, incredible equalizer. Everyone can go out there and report or witness a massacre and show it to the world. But with that, misinformation, disinformation, oversaturation of media everywhere without context, without nuance, you need journalists, you need people who are professionally trained in doing so. And it can start in the classroom. That mindset can start in a classroom. And I thought that was really important. A mindset of looking at other sides of a story, of sitting with something you're super uncomfortable with. I mean, we speak about diversity today. Everyone is a champion of diversity. Well, that should also be about being able to sit with people whose views you radically object to. but being able to sit with them and listen to them and hear them out and ask questions so you can have a dialogue. So that's what I did for a while. And I think that's what's super important to me.
Amazing. And touching on a lot of themes to do with journalism, when we're talking about oversaturation of the market or sensationalism or how everyone is a reporter, in inverted commas, let's get to the nitty gritty. If you're going to survive as a journalist, if you're going to do credible work as a journalist, if you're going to be recognized amongst the masses as a journalist, what sort of skill sets do you think, if you were to give advice to people being journalists nowadays, do they need?
You will bring to the table your hunger, your appetite, your curiosity, your courage, your willingness to go out there in a possibly difficult landscape. And you will have commitment, but you have to have the ability to learn. It's a huge learning curve being a journalist. So having an open mind, essential. Not bringing prejudged ideas to a story, super important. Yes, you want to make a difference out there. And I think it's incredibly important. The importance of listening, which is something that we come back to again and again. For me, the essential importance of understanding that not everyone is a reporter. Everyone thinks they're a reporter because they have a smartphone and they can report, they can bring an eyewitness account onto a social media platform. But that is not reporting. That is bearing witness. And there's something great these days, like open source intelligence, which as journalists, you use all the time to verify or to geolocate something. But being a journalist is something that requires an incredibly strong mindset of a willingness to educate yourself. It's essentially a long education, and you have to be humble, super humble. And we talked about perfectionism before, and there's something that speaks to humility before. You have to be able to put your hands up and said, we have some biases that are natural. It's not going to be perfect, but we've worked damn hard to bring you the best approximation of a truth that we have verified and counter-verified or borne witness to. And we've spoken to various people from different sides of a story. And that's being checked and rechecked. And we have editorial standards and policies. And we've made everything we can to bring you those facts. And it's for you to then, as the audience, to discern, what you want out of that story. But we've given you something out there that we work very hard to do. And I think it's essential. I would say start and become a journalist. I think it's a fantastically important profession. And documentary filmmaking, which is my passion, requires the same skills, the same desire to go to the heart of a complex story, to not be scared of sitting with nuances and complicated little backstories and making sense of it. And I think that's what you bring, the passion, the commitment, the willingness to learn, the willingness to sit back down, and the humility to be part of a team, the humor that it takes to go out there and come back. It's all of these things. I find it more than ever important in a landscape where mainstream media is bashed, where post-truth is a word, that you show there are such things as facts. It's important that we can rely on certain sets of facts. And there is a whole profession out there, and there are a free press. It's a fourth estate in a democracy. It's part of the fabric of a healthy democracy. And it's important that we respect it, but also that there are checks and balances around that. And that not everyone is a reporter. Not every platform out there is trustworthy. And that not information is not knowledge. Information is information. You can have an oversaturation or a junk diet of information and you would feel sick to it. And then you want to detox from it. You have to have a balanced diet of information. And that a journalist is trained to be able to give that to you.
Patricia, thank you so much for sharing everything that you have today. We're actually, believe it or not, coming to the end of the podcast episode. Was there anything else that you wish to finish off with before I ask you one final question?
When to stop. Sometimes there are moments where you will feel burnt out by what you see and the stories you're exposed to in the field. And I think it's really important when you talk about mindset to give yourself the space of self-care, especially as a human who is porous, who is emotionally engaged with stories. I think that is incredibly important to address sometimes as well. You go out there and you tell stories and you're pressurized from left, right, and center. And you're dealing with all the things that you spoke about, perfectionism, responsibility, that sense of duty that's quite overwhelming sometimes. And when it is too much, and when it threads the fine line between journalism and activism, and when you feel overwhelmed, know when to stop, know when to ask for help. That is super important to me, because I didn't always manage to do that. And I had a massive burnout 9 years ago, and I had panic attacks, and I felt a sense of shame of speaking about it, because I felt such a sense of privilege and such a sense of luck that I was alive and well, and I could get myself out of those situations and out of those really difficult places that I had been into. And my colleagues not many spoke about it at the time. It was quite taboo out there, and it was also a bit macho out there. And as a young mother at the time, I felt that I was so lucky that I had that life back here when I was safe in my bed with my kids who were healthy. I felt that incredible sense of shame sometimes, and incredible sense of guilt sometimes. And I feel that is something that you have to be able to mitigate. And I think there are tools in place today and an openness today that is brilliant, but it's still not enough. And I think that's something that the industry could work on better. And that's something that I find very important.
Yeah.
The fact that you talk about trauma and you talk about PTSD, but it can take months and months. It's a bit like the frog in the boiling water. It can take months and months to develop, and something tiny can trigger it, and then you feel terribly silly for falling apart on something like that, when actually there are people who are in war zone and people who keep going back to war zones to report on it, who seem super strong on the outside. And you feel silly that you fall apart in an edit suite, for something as idiotic as someone crying, and it makes you completely unravel. And I think it's important to know when to ask for help, and to know that there's no shame in that, and that it's super healthy, and that good journalism is about also putting your hand up and saying, I'm taking a step back now. I'm going to take a break, and being supported in that.
Yeah. And having that good support network around you, your cheerleaders, as well as knowing when to reach out for help.
Absolutely. It's not super easy, because you will always feel that you are the vessel, that you're not the story, and that you're there to tell someone else's story. And not that you don't matter, but that you are there to provide a service. And sometimes that service does benefit, or will benefit, or benefit mostly if you are strong mentally. Contradictorily and paradoxically, it also benefits when you are vulnerable and open enough to your own humanity.
It's that balance, isn't it, of tuning in with yourself, tuning in with your body, tuning in with recognizing when it might be feeling slightly overwhelming and when the balance might be slightly off, and learning the tools to help you with that, and knowing when to seek help when you need it. Thank you for sharing that. I always finish off with this one last question, because I find it so interesting what people think and the suggestions they come up with. And it doesn't always have to be about the world of self-improvement either. But if you could recommend to the listeners one book to read, what would it be and why?
Stories have been so important to me all my life. So you start with The Little Prince, and then you move on to Little Women, and every story, every book becomes a world in which you dwell and escape and identify with. I'm going to give you my most recent book, which is my favorite book at the moment, because it has called me so much about a world I know very little about. And it's an author that I think everyone out there should read, because she's extraordinary. Her language is extraordinary. Her way of giving voice to people that are pretty invisible is extraordinary. And I'm going to give you Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, who I think is an exceptional author. Basically, she's taken the structure of David Copperfield and placed it in Western Virginia in the Appalachia, and explored and helped us completely identify with the world of a boy called Damon, who is born to an opioid-addicted mother, and looking at structural violence, endemic addiction in the American Appalachians. And I found that world says so much about the world today. It's about sitting with that character for I don't know how many pages. It's quite a big book, 600 pages, 450 pages. And it's a social novel, and it's a compassionate novel, and it's a funny novel, and it's a deeply difficult novel at times. And I have absolutely loved everything she has written. It has her former book that she wrote 25 years ago, Poisonwood Bible, was about 5 women dealing with a very radical husband/father in the Congo in the 1950s. And it's a story about radicalisation and what it does to a family. And it's something that has informed a lot of what I did later on working with radicalisation. And every voice there, every single character is rounded and brilliant. And her compassionate gaze is something that I highly recommend. I absolutely loved Demon Copperhead. I love literature. I think it teaches you everything about humans. And not of what I've done in my small career as a documentary filmmaker was go and sit down with humans. And so and literature has been my education. And she is an exceptional writer and an exceptional opener of worlds. And Demon Copperhead, if you want to understand America today and the world today, that's the novel right now that I would recommend. And it has beautiful passages about the power of nature and about the power of looking at the lens of a very difficult world with an entire ecosystems of voices. I find her brilliant. I find her absolutely stunning as a writer. And she's been my companion for the last few months. And 25 years ago, she was also a catalyst for a lot of what I've done. And so Barbara Kingsolver, Demon Copperhead, for me right now. And many other books will be my favorite in the future. But right now, Demon Copperhead.
Thank you, Patricia.
You're very welcome. It's been lovely sitting with you.
Thank you for tuning into the Mindset Exchange podcast. Your support really means the world to me. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment on your favourite podcast platform. It helps reach more listeners like you. A huge thank you to my wonderful guest, Patricia de Mesquita, for sharing her inspirational insights into journalism, storytelling, and navigating the complexities of the modern media landscape. Her reflections remind us all of the critical role media plays in shaping our understanding of the world. And if you're looking for motivation tips, check out the link in the description for a free downloadable guide. See you next time for more thought-provoking conversations.